When people go missing, it leaves their loved ones in grief, anxiety, and panic. The missing person's families begin to wonder what could have happened to them. Most of the time, the search for these people continues for too long, and their people give up and declare the missing person dead. But fortunately for some, they get found eventually. This video tells you the stories of 15 missing people who were eventually found. Get ready for the thrill. Number 15. Alexander Selkirk. It's probably you're not familiar with the name. However, if you've read the book Robinson Crusoe, you'd relate well to the story. This book, later made into a movie, was branded after Selkirk's story. Selkirk was a Scottish privateer and Royal Navy officer. He decided to spend 4 years and 4 months as a castaway on an uninhabited island in the South Pacific Ocean. Selkirk was on an expedition with Captain Stradling when he notified the captain about necessary repairs that needed to be done on the ship. The captain ignored him, and when they stopped on an island to restock supplies, Selkirk decided to stay behind on the island to avoid riding on a dangerous ship. After some moments, he changed his mind, but it was too late. The captain wouldn't let him into the ship. Selkirk was abandoned on the island, and he had to rely on his survival instincts. He would go on to be alone on the island for 4 years and 4 months, surviving on a well-balanced diet of goats, seafood, watercress, and turnips. On the fateful day that he was finally rescued, he heard noises and went out to find out what it was. He discovered some ships. However, he wasn't sure if they were his enemies or if they would be on his side. But he wouldn't know if he wouldn't take a step, right? So he summoned courage and got their attention. On getting to the shore, Selkirk came out with his hands as a way up of surrendering. It turned out that those on board were English. They let him onto their ship and sailed for another year before getting back to England. His story was written down by someone in his town and had been modified by Daniel Defoe into the book Robinson Crusoe. But how do you abandon a brother on an inhabited island? What a height of cruelty. Number 14. Michelle Whitaker. Whitaker disappeared in early 2002 after being dropped off at a truck stop by a friend. Nobody seemed to know where she was. She was thus reported missing on August 16, 2002. As expected, the friend who dropped her off was taken in as a suspect, but after passing a polygraph, he was ruled out as a suspect. Before disappearing, Whitaker had been arrested for driving under the influence of drugs, DUI, and only disappeared shortly after her release from jail. She was supposed to attend treatment for drug and alcohol abuse as ordered by the court. While she was missing, there was no activity on her credit report and social security number, leaving investigators to suspect foul play. But there was no evidence to support their suspicion. Whitaker's case would later become a subject of a homicide investigation after one of her co-workers, Heather Sellers, went missing too, leaving people thinking there might be a serial killer or abductor on the loose. In the summer of 2008, a woman was watching an episode of Forensic Files that featured the murder conviction of Jonathan Vick, Sellers' boyfriend, whom the police suspected to have murdered Whitaker. Vick had been a suspect in a 1995 rape and murder case whose mystery was still yet to be unraveled at the time. A woman then came across a photo of the supposed murdered Whitaker. It turned out that Whitaker was this woman's neighbor in Oregon. She invited the police, notifying them of Whitaker's place of residence. In August, authorities announced that Whitaker had been found alive in Oregon, where she is living well under the same name. Whitaker reunited with her family and told them she had disappeared to start a new life. Who could blame her? Sometimes we just need a break from familiar faces to find some peace. We do not recommend such unruly behavior, though. It pays to try therapy, or at least inform one's loved ones about the decision to take a break. Number 13. Denise Bolser. On January 17, 1985, Bolser disappeared from her home in Raymond, New Hampshire, where she shared with her estranged husband. Earlier in the day, she had dropped off her husband in Manchester and driven in his truck back home. This is because she took hers to a workshop for repairs. Bolser's husband got home to see a note that read, "We've got your wife." He also found some footprints in the snow. Who could have kidnapped his wife, and what could have been the reason? Would the kidnappers reach out to make demands for ransom? These would have been some of the questions on his mind at the time. Several days later, police found the truck abandoned at Logan Airport. After searching through it, they discovered Bolser's birth certificate, credit card, and social security card. But there was no evidence as to where she could be. Authorities suspected that she was kidnapped and possibly murdered, but there was no real evidence to support that. They concluded that she left on her own accord. Her family had a contrary notion. Since the police could not solve the mystery surrounding her disappearance, her husband filed for divorce. This eventually ended his pursuit as a person of interest in the case. A couple of months after her disappearance, her employer, a courier service company, accused her of embezzling between $12,000 and $100,000. In 1986, she was charged with absentia, but the charges were later dropped. However, in 2002, a private investigator gave a lead about a particular Denise residing in Florida. She shared the same date of birth as the missing Denise Bolser. The lead was followed, and it turned out to be true. Denise had been living in Panama City, Florida under a new name, Denise James. She confessed to having run away after her ex-boss threatened her life. Number 12. Michelle McMullen. 27-year-old Michelle McMullen had only dropped off her 6-year-old son Jaden at a friend's house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when she went missing on September 28, 2002. Upon dropping her son off, she drove back to Louisiana, where she schooled. At night, she called her friend to bid her son goodnight, promising to call again. She never called back. Before she disappeared, her parents had promised to take care of her son at their home while she returned to Louisiana to finish her degree at Grambling State University. Michelle's car was eventually found on the roadside off McGowan's Avenue in Hagerstown, Maryland, with her cell phone, credit cards, purse, and some money. McMullen was fired from the Progress Emmanuel Presbyterian Church for poor work performance, and the police declared her wanted on charges bordering on $2,400 theft. However, in December 2008, a family friend tipped detectives that McMullen was working at a hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia. What a snitch, she must have thought. But before the detectives arrived, McMullen fled. 3 years later, a woman who had seen the disappeared episode that featured Michelle McMullen's story called in to report that she had seen McMullen work as a hairdresser in Oakland, California under a new name, Danielle Jones. The police swung into action and caught McMullen. She was taken back to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and subsequently charged with fraud, theft, and forgery. She was eventually sentenced and ordered to pay $6,000 in restitution. Number 11. Chioma Gray. On the morning of December 13, 2007, when Gray was last seen, she had been dropped off by her father and brother at Buena High School in Ventura. Her mother arrived at the school in the afternoon to pick her up, but she was missing. School officials and her friends never saw her in class. Her family reported her as a missing person, and investigators from the Ventura Police Department began to search for her. He was convicted for the said offense, but was later released on probation for 3 years with the condition that he would not have any contact with Gray or any other minor in the absence of a responsible adult. Also, police received a report of a 2008 white Acura missing from the car lot in Ventura, where Tafoya worked. Before Gray's disappearance, he was last seen driving the car earlier that morning. A security camera at Gray's school had captured a vehicle whose description matched the stolen vehicles pulling up at the school. The vehicle license plate number was later discovered to have passed the Mexican border. In 2010, a private investigator reported that he found the stolen car in a compound near Acapulco, a city in southern Mexico. He also found evidence that indicated that Tafoya and Gray worked and lived there. On September 1, 2011, Tafoya called Gray's mother asking her to come pick her up in Mexico. A month later, Gray and Tafoya returned to California with U.S. Marshals. Tafoya was arrested and charged with felony, child stealing, and felony probation violation. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Number 10. Judith Bello. Judith Bello, a mother of 2 working at the National Food Corporation in Sylvania, was last seen on December 13, 1993. The 28-year-old married woman who resided in Stanwood, Washington, failed to pick up her son from daycare. Her car was found to have been abandoned by the city's post office, triggering an investigation that lasted for almost 2 decades. In 2011, the sheriff's department received a call from a woman who claimed she saw herself profiled in missing people's cases on their official website. The woman turned out to be the Judith that had been declared missing for nearly 2 decades. She told the authorities that she was fine and living in California. It was claimed that she never committed any crime and could therefore not be charged. While investigating the circumstances that led to her disappearance, investigators found out that Judith had been a victim of a series of domestic violence, and she had to leave Washington state as a result. Though she had 2 children with her abusive husband, she would later go on to have 3 more sons after she left her husband. The reason why she never contacted neither her family nor the sheriff's office until 2011 was not known. However, there is speculation that she practically went into hiding because she was scared of her husband. Her story is that of someone who solved her missing case herself. Number 9. Timothy Carney. Timothy Carney, a 25-year-old man, was on his way to morning prayer at the Gospel Outreach Church on September 28, 2004, when he suddenly disappeared. His roommate, Roy Anthony, last saw him at their Butler Ridge apartment. He had informed his employer that he would be late for work, but no one heard anything further from him about his whereabouts. His mother told investigators that the church group to which he belonged was trying to disassociate him from his family and friends. Later on, police found his car abandoned on the roadside at the border of Elizabeth and Newark. 4 days after his disappearance, it was reported that Timothy withdrew $1,000 in cash from an ATM. This led investigators to believe that he probably faked his disappearance and that a third party might not have been involved at all. After 7 years of intense searching, in 2011, Timothy was found by the Kristen Foundation, an organization dedicated to bringing home missing persons. His missing case, filed at the Morris County Prosecutor's Office, was subsequently closed. Timothy's parents are as confused as anybody else as to why their son failed to contact them for so long. Who knows why he refused to keep any contact with his family? It could be the church's influence on him or other personal reasons. Whatever the reason, his family was happy to learn that he was at least safe. Number 8. Lula Gillespie Miller. Gillespie Miller had just given birth to her third child when she disappeared from Laurel, Indiana in 1974. Before she went missing, she signed off the responsibility of taking care of her children to her parents. Her family would end up not having any contact with her for the next 40 years, other than a postmarked letter from Richmond, Indiana in 1975. However, in 2014, the Doe Network, an organization committed to helping families find missing persons, reached out to Scott Jarvis, an Indiana State Police detective sergeant, to help investigate Lula Gillespie Miller's case. Relying on the missing mother's letter, Jarvis found a case of a deceased unidentified woman in the records of the Richmond Police Department. After comparing the deceased woman's DNA with that of Tammy Miller, Gillespie Miller's daughter, it came out negative. In 2016, authorities got wind of another woman who shared some similarities with the long-missing Indiana mom who had lived in Tennessee in the 1980s before moving to Texas. Authorities tracked this woman down to a town in South Texas. Turns out she had been living there since the 1990s under an alias. Lula Gillespie Miller admitted to having left her family voluntarily. Police declared that she had committed no crime and reserved the right to anonymity about her disappearance. They wouldn't reveal the alias she used or identify the town where she lives now. It was reported that Lula Gillespie Miller declared that her daughter could be given her contact address so she could reunite with her. According to a statement by police, she thought she was too young to be a mother. Number 7. Petra Pazitka. Petra Pazitka had visited the dentist in 1984 when she disappeared. At the time, she was a 24-year-old college student from Germany. Note that she never died at the dentist's office, so don't let that scare you away from making your next appointment with your dentist. Here's how the story went. Pazitka was supposed to show up for her brother's birthday on a later day, but she didn't. However, since Pazitka was a young woman, the police suspected murder and featured her on a German true crime show. In 1987, a man known as Gunter K. confessed to killing Pazitka after his earlier confession to killing another 14-year-old. Police believed him, but a body to substantiate his claim was never found. He later withdrew his confession. Eventually, Pazitka was declared dead in 1989, and the case was officially closed. However, in 2015, a woman in Dusseldorf named Mrs. Schneider called the police to give notice of a burglary attack on her apartment. She couldn't produce an ID. She confessed to being Petra Pazitka, the woman declared missing in the late 1980s. It was clear that she intentionally refused to open a bank account or get a social security card to aid the discovery of her identity. She had lived in several German cities under a false name for 3 decades. Pazitka never disclosed the reasons for her disappearance to the police. She ruled out the possibility of having family issues. She also stated that she was not interested in reuniting with her family. She was unaware that her father had already passed away. Number 6. Jaycee Dugard. In 1991, Dugard, an 11-year-old girl, disappeared on her way to a school bus stop from her South Lake Tahoe home, raising fears that she might have been kidnapped and possibly murdered. The search continued for days to weeks and then to years. Nobody could have thought that Dugard was living in a shed in the backyard of the Garridos in Antioch, where she was kept prisoner. Dugard had told the Garridos that her family didn't love her and that there was no way they would look out for her. During her stint with the Garridos, she was raped continuously by Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender on parole. She eventually gave birth to 2 daughters for him and never thought of returning home. Garrido brought Dugard's 2 daughters with him on his visit to the coordinator of special events at the UC Berkeley campus, where he planned to have a religious event. The special events manager noticed some unusual behavior from the young ladies and Philip. He thus informed the parole officer, Edward Santos Jr., who ordered Philip to take the two girls to a parole office in Concord. Philip was accompanied by a woman who turned out to be the missing Dugard. After Dugard's reappearance, Philip and his wife, Nancy, were arrested by the police. The duo pled guilty to kidnapping and raping Dugard. Consequently, Philip and Nancy were sentenced to 431 and 36 years of life imprisonment, respectively. Dugard was reunited with her family, who got a $20 million compensation from the state of California for lack of thoroughness in Garrido's parole supervision. Only one could imagine the traumatic experience the little girl must have gone through. Number 5. Marks Panama Barnes. The story of Marks Panama Barnes is the story of a missing man that solved his own case after about 3 decades. Marks Panama Barnes, whose real name is Steve Carter, wanted to know more about his childhood and his real parents. The 35-year-old man would later learn about his past through a simple internet search. Carter had to read about Carlina White, a woman from Atlanta who realized she was snatched from her mother as a baby at a hospital in Harlem. Carter's story boosted Marks's morale to search further into his origin too. And luckily for him, he stumbled upon a picture of a baby named Marks Panama Barnes on a missing children's website. He would later find out that he was the baby in the picture and that he had been born in Honolulu, Hawaii, but went missing with his mother, Charlotte Moriarty. After his mother's disappearance, Carter's father, Mark Barnes, reported him and his mother missing. Carter was 61 when he discovered this true identity. His mother had taken him to a stranger's home, given him a fake name and birth date. She was then taken to a psychiatric hospital where baby Carter was put in protective care. His mother disappeared a few days later and never returned. Carter would be placed in an orphanage where he would be introduced to Steve and Pat Carter, who, unknown to him, were his foster parents and not his biological parents. Realizing his identity, he called Jennifer Monheimer, his older half-sister, who was behind the appearance of this picture on the missing children's website. She had convinced Hawaiian officials in 2001 to reopen the investigation into her brother's disappearance. Carter, who was last seen in 1977, was finally reunited with his family in 2011, over 3 decades later. Number 4. Carlos Sanchez Ortiz. Carlos Sanchez Ortiz was a Spanish physician who wandered into the woods to run from burnout. Just after getting his medical degree in 1996, Sanchez disappeared. He had suffered from severe depression and decided to abandon civilization. For years, he was not found and was therefore declared dead in 2010. However, 2 mushroom pickers reported seeing a man with a long beard and a dirty face while foraging in a national park in northern Tuscany. The man's passport, though faded and expired, identified him as Carlos Sanchez Ortiz, the man that had been declared dead when he could not be found. Sanchez had told the mushroom pickers that he resorted to living in the woods because he did not want to live around people any longer. However, since his cover was now blown, he decided to move his camp. The pickers contacted a Spanish Missing Persons Association, which managed to inform his parents. His parents immediately traveled to Tuscany to find their son. Unfortunately, he had left there and changed location. His parents insisted looking for him. According to them, they would respect his will and his freedom and wouldn't leave until they had held him in their arms again. It's not clear if the reunion ever happened. Notwithstanding, his parents were happy that their son was alive and got some relief for the terrible tragedy in which they had been living. Number 3. Lucy Ann Johnson. In September 1961, Lucy, an Alaskan-born woman married to Marvin Johnson, went missing. Her husband would not report her missing until 4 years later. Police learned that Lucy's disappearance and confronted the husband, who admitted he had not seen her since 1961. Police suspected foul play following a neighbor's account that he saw Marvin digging in his backyard. It turned out to be for a septic tank. They searched the tank, but there was nothing there to serve as evidence to charge Marvin with a crime. Efforts to match DNA from the couple's children with unidentified bodies proved abortive. Linda Evans, who was 7 years old when her mother disappeared, came to believe that her mother was dead. In 2013, when she was in her 50s, she decided to take action on her mother's disappearance case. She took out a Yukon News ad stating Lucy's name, place of birth, and parents' names. A woman in Whitehorse in the Yukon learned about the ad and called Lucy, who was now 77, informing her of a missing persons report for her in a paper. She turned out to be the dead Lucy. She stayed in British Columbia until about 1980. She later moved to the Yukon, where she was eventually found. She had remarried and had additional 4 children. After Lucy was found, Marvin, who had died in the 1990s, was officially cleared of all charges against him as regards his possible involvement in her disappearance. Number 2. Edgar Ladalep. The story of Edgar Ladalep is that of a Canadian man who came home after 30 years. He's one of the longest missing persons. Ladalep has a mental age of 12. In other words, he was an adult who functioned at a child's level. This left him being placed in a home for the disabled in Ontario province. Ladalep was living on a disability pension. However, he vanished in 1986 when returning from Niagara Falls, where he had initially gone. He was 12 years old then. 3 years later, victims of violence revealed their intention to use new technology to flash photographs of missing people in public places in the hopes that someone would identify them. Despite this technology, there was no lead on the whereabouts of Ladalep. 3 decades would pass, yet there was still no word from him. After a short while, the news that Ladalep had been found came to the limelight in 2016. According to the news, Ladalep had left the Waterloo region and stopped in the Niagara region. Shortly after arriving there, he suffered a head injury that left him with amnesia. He would not recall his identity and where he came from, so he decided to create a new identity and start a new life. He wasn't aware his family had been looking for him all those years. Obviously, he maintained a low profile and didn't use social media. Suddenly, he realized some of his memory was returning. He thus informed his social worker, who helped him reunite with his family. Number 1. Harold Wayne Lovell. Harold Wayne Lovell had been living in Florida, having left Chicago because of a family situation. He had told his family that he was looking for a construction job when he disappeared in May of 1977. He was only 19 at the time. Authorities assumed that Lovell was a victim of a notorious serial killer known as John Wayne Gacy, as he vanished around the same time that Gacy was involved in a killing spree between 1972 and 1978. But they were wrong. After 34 years, a police booking photo revealed that Lovell was alive in South Florida. His family contacted the sheriff's office and detectives tracked him down. Now 53 years old, when he was seen, Lovell revealed how he worked in a shipbuilding and landscaping before having a few fights with the police. It was one of those fights that led to the booking photo that eventually made him discovered by his long-lost siblings. Lovell was happy to reunite with his family. However, it was unfortunate that Lovell's mother, Kathy, died, not knowing where her son could be. Even before her death, she never gave up on the search for him. If you suspect anyone wandering in your environment that you might feel is a missing person, tell us about it in the comments. Also, let us know which of these stories intrigued you the most.